Texas, autumn 1944. The scent of cinnamon and butter drifted through the chain-link fence of Camp Swift, carried on wind that smelled of cedar and distant rain. Inside the mess hall, 40 German prisoners sat frozen before plates of apple pie, golden-crusted, steam rising. The latticework perfect as any grandmother's recipe. Some stared, others looked away. 3 young men began to weep before their forks ever touched the porcelain, tears cutting lines through dust on weathered faces, because this pie was impossible. It was their mother's hands reaching across an ocean of war. The trucks rolled into Bastrop County on a morning when fog hung low over the Colorado River. October 1943. The war in Europe raged with a brutality that newspapers struggled to capture. But here, in the hill country southeast of Austin, the land lay untouched by artillery fire. Live oaks spread their branches like benedictions. Cattle grazed on slopes that turned golden in the afternoon light. Camp Swift sprawled across 56,000 acres of Texas rangeland, its hastily constructed barracks and guard towers a jarring geometry against the organic curves of the landscape. The camp had opened just months earlier, designed to hold thousands, American soldiers training for overseas deployment, and increasingly prisoners of war captured in North Africa and Europe. The German POWs arrived in batches throughout late 1943 and early 1944. They came by train, packed into cars marked with white crosses on the roof so Allied aircraft wouldn't strafe them by mistake. They had been told many things about America. Nazi propaganda painted vivid pictures. A nation of gangsters and plutocrats, where black and white fought in the streets, where Jews controlled everything, where workers starved while millionaires feasted. The reality that greeted them defied every prepared narrative. Hans Mueller was 23 when he first saw Texas through the slats of a prisoner transport. He had been a teacher in Bavaria before the war, conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1940, captured by American forces in Tunisia in May 1943. The journey from North Africa to Texas took 6 weeks, ships across the Atlantic, trains through ports where American civilians didn't throw stones or spit, but merely watched with expressions he couldn't read. "I expected something like Dachau," Hans would write years later in his memoir. "I had seen photographs the SS showed us of Soviet camps. Barbed wire, guard towers with machine guns, starvation rations, beatings for any infraction. That was what prisoners received. That was what we believed we deserved, having lost." Instead, the gates of Camp Swift opened onto rows of wooden barracks painted white, mess halls with screened windows, a recreation yard with volleyball nets. The Texas heat hit like a physical force, different from European summer, thick and encompassing. Cicadas screamed in the live oaks. Somewhere beyond the fence, a rooster crowed. The camp commander, Colonel James Harrison, was a West Point graduate who had studied the Geneva Convention with the same rigor he applied to tactical manuals. He believed in rules. Rules meant civilization persisted even in wartime. Rules meant America proved itself different. "You will work," Harrison told the assembled prisoners through a translator on their first day. "You will be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip. You will receive the same rations as American enlisted men. You will be treated according to international law. You will not be tortured or humiliated. But you will also not escape, because there is nowhere to escape to." "We are in the middle of Texas, gentlemen. The nearest port is 500 miles away. The nearest German territory is an ocean and a war away." Hans looked at the other prisoners. Some were younger, 17 or 18, conscripted in the desperate final pushes. Others were older, career soldiers with iron crosses and vacant expressions. All of them carried the peculiar exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from moral confusion. The slow, grinding realization that everything they had been told might be a lie. The work began immediately. Camp Swift needed laborers for construction, for maintenance, for the endless tasks of keeping a military installation functioning. The Geneva Convention prohibited forcing POWs to work on anything directly related to the war effort, but there was plenty else to do. Road crews, agricultural details, kitchen duty. The German prisoners were organized into work details and sent out each morning under guard. This was where the propaganda began to crack, not through speeches or films, but through the accumulated weight of small, ordinary kindnesses that made no sense within the Nazi worldview. Werner Schmidt, a former mechanic from Hamburg, was assigned to a road crew working outside the town of Bastrop. The guards carried rifles but rarely pointed them. At mid-morning, a truck arrived with water barrels. Not the tepid, chemical-tasting liquid Werner expected, but cool water with chunks of ice floating in it. A guard offered him a cigarette, American tobacco, not the ersatz sawdust mixture German soldiers had smoked. "Hot enough for you?" the guard asked, grinning. Werner didn't understand English well yet, but he understood the tone. It wasn't mocking. It was the tone men used everywhere when weather became a shared complaint. A bridge across language and uniform. By noon, the heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves. The prisoners worked stripped to the waist, their pale European skin burning red despite warnings from the guards. A pickup truck pulled up, driven by an older woman in a cotton dress and wide-brimmed hat. She stepped out carrying a basket covered with checkered cloth. "Brought you boys some sandwiches," she announced to the guards. Then, seeing the prisoners, she hesitated only a moment. "Well, I suppose they get hungry too." Her name was Martha Kowalski, third-generation Polish-American, married to a rancher who supplied beef to the camp. She distributed sandwiches, thick slices of roast beef on fresh bread with lettuce and mustard, to guards and prisoners alike. Werner took his carefully, as if it might vanish. The bread was soft. The beef was real, not the grisly substitutes he remembered from German army rations. "Danke," he said quietly. Martha nodded. "You're welcome, honey." That word, honey, hit Werner with unexpected force. It was what his mother had called him, a term of endearment crossing enemy lines, offered by a woman who had no reason to see him as anything but a symbol of the regime that had plunged the world into war. These moments multiplied across the autumn of 1943 and winter of 1944. Friedrich Bauer, a farmer's son from Saxony, was assigned to work at a nearby dairy. The ranch owner, Tom Henderson, watched Friedrich work for 3 days before speaking beyond basic instructions. On the 4th day, Tom offered Friedrich a thermos of coffee during the morning break. "You know cows," Tom observed. Not a question. Yes, my father, he has, had dairy farm." Tom nodded slowly. "This damn war." They stood together in silence, watching the cattle move toward the milking barn. Tom pulled out a photograph from his wallet, a young man in army uniform, dark-haired, serious-eyed. "My son, somewhere in France now. Hope to God he meets farmers over there who remember what it's like to just work the land." Friedrich looked at the photograph, then at Tom. "I hope also." This was not supposed to happen. The Nazi worldview depended on clear divisions, superior races and inferior ones, enemies who were fundamentally different, wars that justified any means. But here, in the Texas heat, among people who had no propaganda officers watching them, those divisions became harder to maintain. By spring 1944, something unexpected was developing in the town surrounding Camp Swift. The local women, ranch wives, farmers' daughters, school teachers, shop owners, had begun to see the German prisoners not as abstractions but as individuals. Young men, far from home, caught in circumstances beyond their control. This awareness grew from proximity. The work details brought prisoners into town regularly. They repaired fences along ranch roads, harvested cotton on farms where American men had gone to war, worked in sawmills and grain elevators. They were guarded but not isolated. They were visible. Sarah McKinney was 29, married to a Marine fighting in the Pacific, mother to 2 young daughters. She taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church and organized the county's USO volunteer efforts. One April morning, she saw a work detail of German prisoners repairing the fence around the town cemetery. One prisoner, younger than the others, was struggling with a post hole digger. The ground was rocky, resistant. His hands, pale and uncalloused, were already bleeding. Sarah recognized the awkwardness of someone unused to physical labor. She thought of her husband's letters describing Marines fresh from college, stumbling through boot camp. She brought water. Then she brought gloves. "Those rocks will tear you up," she said, holding out the leather work gloves. The young prisoner, his name tag read Richter, looked at the guard, who shrugged permission. He took the gloves carefully, as if they might be snatched away. "Thank you, ma'am," he said in heavily accented English. "Where are you from?" Sarah asked. "Berlin. I was student. Philosophy." A philosophy student digging post holes in a Texas cemetery. The absurdity and tragedy of it settled over Sarah like dust. She thought of her husband, who had been studying law before Pearl Harbor. She thought of how arbitrary everything had become. Who fought, who survived, who ended up on which side of the wire. "Well," she said finally, "welcome to Bastrop County." Word spread through the women's networks, church groups, garden clubs, volunteer organizations. The prisoners were human. They were young. They were homesick. And increasingly, the women began to act on a peculiarly American impulse: hospitality. At first it was small gestures, cookies left with the guards to distribute, magazines donated to the camp library, a piano donated to the recreation hall when someone learned several prisoners were musicians. But by summer 1944, something larger was taking shape. Margaret Walsh proposed it at a meeting of the Bastrop Ladies Auxiliary in July. She was 56, her 3 sons all serving overseas, her kitchen a command center for every charitable effort in the county. "These boys are being held at Camp Swift. They're far from their families. Many of them celebrate Christmas the same as we do. I propose we organize a proper Christmas dinner for them. Turkey, all the trimmings and desserts. Pies especially. Everyone should have pie for Christmas." The room went silent. Then Evelyn Hart, whose husband had been killed at Anzio, spoke quietly. "My Robert always said we were fighting for what we believe in, not against what they believe. If we believe in Christian charity, in treating people with dignity, then we do it even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Others nodded. The vote was unanimous. The Christmas dinner plan grew throughout the autumn. What began as a simple meal expanded into something more ambitious, a demonstration of American abundance and, perhaps unconsciously, a challenge to everything the prisoners had been taught about their captors. The women organized themselves with military efficiency. Margaret Walsh became the de facto commander, assigning tasks, tracking contributions, coordinating with Colonel Harrison at Camp Swift. The colonel approved the plan with one condition. The Christmas dinner would happen, but several weeks before Christmas itself. December 3, 1944. Security concerns about actual holidays, he explained. The women accepted this compromise. Ranchers donated turkeys. The camp itself would provide the basic rations: potatoes, vegetables, bread. But the women insisted on adding everything that made a meal feel like home. Cranberry sauce, stuffing with sage and onions, gravy made from drippings, not from packets, and pies. Every woman with an oven volunteered to bake. Helen Bradford specialized in apple pie. Her recipe came from her grandmother, who had brought it from Virginia in a covered wagon in 1855. The crust required a specific ratio of butter to shortening, ice water added 1 tablespoon at a time. The dough rolled thin enough to see light through it. The filling was Macintosh apples when possible, mixed with Granny Smith for tartness, sugar, and cinnamon, and a secret ingredient, a tablespoon of cider vinegar that brightened the whole. "This is the pie that won my husband," Helen told her daughter while measuring flour. "The pie my mother made when we were so poor we were eating cornmeal mush 3 times a day. But she found apples and made us remember we were still a family. This is the pie I made for every birthday, every holiday, every time someone needed to know they were loved." She would make 8 pies for the prisoners. Other women would make dozens more: pecan, pumpkin, cherry, custard. The pies were more than dessert. They were messages written in butter and sugar saying, "You are not forgotten. You are not less than human." This is what we believe about mercy. Morning arrived cold and clear. Texas winters are rarely harsh, but this December brought a snap that turned breath to fog and made the live oak stand stark against pale sky. The prisoners woke to an unusual order. No work details today. Instead, a formation in the yard after breakfast. Hans Muller sensed something different in the air. Guards smiled more. There was an anticipation that felt almost festive. Through the fence, he saw pickup trucks arriving, women unloading covered dishes, the camp kitchen busier than usual. "What is happening?" he asked another prisoner. "I heard it's some kind of special meal. American propaganda, probably. Show us how prosperous they are while Germany starves." But Hans wasn't sure. The cynicism that had sustained him through capture and imprisonment felt increasingly hollow. Nothing about Camp Swift matched what he had expected about enemy captivity. At 11 o'clock, the prisoners were marched to the largest mess hall, which had been transformed. The utilitarian tables were covered with white cloths, donated by churches throughout the county. Centerpieces of pine branches and holly berries decorated each table. The smell hit them first. Roasting turkey, sage, cinnamon, butter, all the scents that meant feast, meant celebration, meant home. The women served. This was radical. Enemy soldiers being served by American civilians, women who had sons and husbands fighting those same soldiers' former comrades. But the women moved through the aisles with the same efficiency they brought to church suppers, placing plates heaped with food before men who sat in stunned silence. Friedrich Bauer looked at his plate. Turkey, both white and dark meat, skin crisp to gold. Mashed potatoes with butter melting in the center. Green beans, cranberry sauce, stuffing, gravy, roll with more butter. It was more food than he had seen on a plate since before the war. "Eat up," said the woman who had served him. Sarah McKinney, though Friedrich didn't know her name. "There's plenty more." Slowly, tentatively, the prisoners began to eat. Some wept quietly while chewing, overwhelmed by flavors they had forgotten existed. Others ate mechanically, as if afraid the food would vanish. The guards ate at separate tables, but from the same meal, and this equality felt significant. A message that everyone deserved dignity. Everyone deserved a feast day. Then came dessert. Helen Bradford carried her apple pies into the mess hall on a cart, the latticed crust still warm, the smell of cinnamon and apple filling spaces where words failed. She cut each pie carefully, making sure the slices were generous, making sure the filling stayed intact, making sure each piece looked like something worth receiving. The first slice went to Werner Schmidt, the mechanic from Hamburg. Helen placed it before him with the same care she would have used serving her own family. The pie steamed slightly, the crust golden brown, the filling visible through the lattice. Apple chunks and cinnamon syrup thickened just enough, not too sweet, perfectly balanced. Werner stared at it. His hands trembled on the edge of the table. He made no move toward the fork beside his plate. "Son," Helen said gently, "it's for you." Werner looked up at her. His eyes were wet. "My mother," he said in broken English. "She make this. Apfelkuchen, before the war, before everything." Helen felt her own throat tighten. She placed her hand briefly on Werner's shoulder, a touch that violated every regulation about fraternizing with prisoners, a touch that acknowledged something deeper than nationality or uniform. "Then this is from your mother too," she said. "All our mothers making pie, hoping our boys remember there's sweetness in the world." Werner picked up his fork. The first bite broke the crust, and the filling, still warm, carried with it every autumn his mother had made Apfelkuchen in their Berlin kitchen. The apples from their neighbor's tree, the cinnamon bought from the market on Unter den Linden, the sugar carefully rationed even before the war. His mother's hands, flour-dusted, checking the oven temperature by feel. He chewed slowly, and tears ran down his face unchecked. Around him, other prisoners were having similar moments. Friedrich Bauer sobbed into his napkin before tasting the pecan pie before him, its sweetness a cruelty and a kindness intertwined. Hans Müller ate his slice of pumpkin pie in mechanical bites, each one dismantling another brick in the wall. Nazi ideology had built around his heart. 3 young prisoners at the back table, none older than 20, received slices of cherry pie, the filling bright red through the lattice, and all 3 began to cry before their forks ever touched the porcelain. They wept for mothers they missed, for childhoods obliterated by politics they never chose, for the impossible gentleness of enemies who served them dessert. The women watched this and understood something profound. They had meant to offer comfort, to demonstrate Christian charity, to show that America treated even enemies with dignity. What they hadn't anticipated was the weight of memory that simple food could carry, the way flavors could cross oceans and resurrect loss. Margaret Walsh stood near the kitchen door, watching Helen Bradford move from table to table, offering seconds of pie to anyone who wanted it. Almost everyone did. These young men, fed propaganda about American weakness and depravity, ate slice after slice of pie made by hands that could have hated them but chose otherwise. "This is how you defeat Nazism," Margaret whispered to Sarah McKinney beside her. "Not with bullets, with pie, with showing them that mercy isn't weakness. That kindness isn't something you withhold from enemies, that humanity persists." Sarah nodded, thinking of her husband in the Pacific, hoping someone there might show him the same unexpected grace if he were ever captured, ever far from home, ever in need of remembering that the world held more than violence. The Christmas dinner, though held on December 3rd, became known among the prisoners simply as the Day of the Pies. In letters home, carefully censored by both American and German authorities, the prisoners tried to explain what had happened. Hans Müller wrote to his sister in Bavaria, "We were served a feast by American women whose sons fight against our army. They gave us pies, real pies, Liesel, like Mutti used to make. I don't understand this country. Everything we were told is wrong. The Americans are not savages. They are not without culture. They have something we lost. They remember that enemies are also human." The German censors allowed this letter through, perhaps recognizing that describing American treatment of POWs according to Geneva Convention rules served Germany's propaganda purposes, proof that if Germany lost, its soldiers would not be massacred. Werner Schmidt wrote to his mother, "Today I ate Apfelkuchen, not exactly like yours. The apples were different, sweeter than the German varieties. But the care put into it was the same. The woman who served it to me touched my shoulder, Mutti, as you would. As if I were her son, I am trying to understand what this means for everything we believed." This letter was held by censors. It raised questions. What did he mean by everything we believed? Was this defeatist thinking? Was Schmidt being corrupted by American psychological warfare? But psychological warfare implies manipulation, and there was nothing manipulative about women baking pies with their grandmother's recipes, serving them to young men who wept at the taste of home. Friedrich Bauer wrote to no one. His entire family had died in the bombing of Dresden, a fact he wouldn't learn until 1945. But he kept a diary, entries written in the margins of books from the camp library, tiny handwriting documenting transformation. December 3, 1944. Today I understood that propaganda works by making you forget that the enemy eats the same foods, misses the same things, loves the same way. A woman served me pie and called me son. In that moment, the war ended for me. Not the shooting war that continues, but the war in my heart, the one that made it possible to see Americans as fundamentally different, as justifiable targets. That war died over pecan pie. The Christmas dinner had consequences nobody anticipated. The women who served, having seen the prisoners' reactions, couldn't unsee them. They continued bringing food, not feasts but regular gifts, cookies for work details, sandwiches, coffee, small gestures that accumulated into relationships. Sarah McKinney began teaching English to several prisoners who showed interest. Once a week they met in a corner of the recreation hall, guards present but distant. She used newspapers, magazines, children's books. The prisoners learned vocabulary, democracy, freedom, vote, dissent. In Germany, one prisoner said, "We do not have this word, dissent. If you speak against government, you disappear." In America, Sarah explained, dissent is patriotic. We believe government serves people, not the other way around. We argue about everything, It's loud and messy and sometimes frustrating, but it means we're free. This was more dangerous than pie. Ideas, once planted, grow unpredictably. Several prisoners began reading American newspapers available in the camp library, carefully censored for operational security but still revealing. They read about congressional debates, about citizens protesting government policies without being arrested, about newspapers criticizing the president without being shut down. Werner Schmidt, the mechanic, studied these newspapers as if they were sacred texts. "This is what we were told was chaos," he said to Hans Muller. "They said democracy was weak, that strong nations need strong leaders who make decisions without endless debate. But look, they are winning the war. Their democracy builds more planes, more tanks, feeds more soldiers, and they treat prisoners like humans. How is this weak?" Hans had no answer. He was experiencing his own transformation, slower but equally profound. A schoolteacher before the war, he had believed in education, in Enlightenment values, in reason. Then the Nazis had promised national renewal, and he had been young enough, naive enough, desperate enough to believe. Now, in a prisoner camp in Texas, eating food provided by enemy civilians, he was rediscovering the values he had abandoned. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was ending. News filtered into Camp Swift, Germany retreating on all fronts, Hitler's suicide, surrender. The prisoners reacted with mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the dying would stop. Dread about what came next. What would Germany become? What would happen to them? The women of Bastrop County continued their visits. Helen Bradford brought more pies, not just for holidays now, but for birthdays for no reason, because she had apples and someone should eat them. Margaret Walsh organized a camp garden project, teaching prisoners to grow vegetables, giving them something to nurture rather than destroy. "When you go home," she told Werner Schmidt while showing him how to stake tomato plants, "remember this. Remember that growing things is harder than destroying them, but more important. Remember that people who were supposed to be your enemies taught you to garden. Take that home." The repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. The prisoners were processed, questioned, classified according to their level of Nazi affiliation. Those deemed low risk were sent home first. Those with deeper involvement in the party were held longer, subjected to denazification programs. Hans Müller was released in March 1946. Before leaving Camp Swift, he sought out Colonel Harrison. "Sir, I wish to thank you for treatment according to law, for showing me that enemies can remain civilized." Harrison shook his hand. "Take that home, son. Germany will need people who remember what civilization looks like." Hans also found Helen Bradford. She was delivering pies to the camp as she had done for over a year. He stood awkwardly before her, this woman who had fed him, whose kindness had undone years of propaganda. "Mrs. Bradford, I am returning to Germany. I want you to know, your pie, it changed me. Make me remember my mother, my home before Nazis, before everything wrong. I will remember. I will tell others." Helen's eyes filled. She pressed a piece of paper into his hand, her apple pie recipe, written in careful English. "Make this for your children someday," she said. "Tell them about Texas. Tell them about how people can choose mercy." Werner Schmidt left in July 1946. Before boarding the train, he gave Sarah McKinney a small carving he had made in the camp workshop, a miniature cedar post, smooth and perfect, with "thank you" carved in English on one side, "Danke" on the other. "You teach me more than English," he said. "You teach me that democracy is not weakness, that freedom makes stronger country, not weaker. I will remember." Friedrich Bauer left in September 1946. Tom Henderson, the rancher he had worked for, drove to the camp to say goodbye. "You're a good hand," Tom said, which in ranch terminology was high praise. "If things had been different," Friedrich nodded. "Different world, we are friends." "Maybe we are anyway," Tom said. "War doesn't change everything." The prisoners returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The Reich had collapsed, cities were rubble, millions displaced or dead. But they carried with them something unexpected, a model of how society could function differently. Hans Müller became a teacher again, this time in the American zone of occupied Germany. He taught English and civics, emphasizing democratic principles. When students asked about America, he described not military might but apple pie served by women whose sons fought Germany. He described being treated as human when he was labeled enemy. This is what democracy looks like, he told his students. Not perfection. America has its own problems, its own contradictions. But the belief that everyone deserves basic dignity, basic rights, that the state serves people, not the other way, that you can disagree with government and not disappear. These ideas are strong, not weak. Werner Schmidt opened a garage in Hamburg. He married, had children, prospered in the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of German recovery. He hung an American flag in his workshop, alongside the German flag. And when customers asked why, he told them about Camp Swift, about women who fed enemies, about learning that former enemies could become partners in rebuilding. Friedrich Bauer went to Argentina briefly. Like many Germans, he considered emigration, but returned to Germany in 1950. He bought a small dairy farm in Bavaria. He corresponded with Tom Henderson until Tom's death in 1968. They never met again, but the letters continued, bridging what war had tried to separate. And the women? They went back to their lives, to husbands returning from war, to children growing up, to the everyday work of rebuilding normalcy. But they had learned something too, that kindness is not passivity, that mercy is not weakness, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is treating enemies as human. Helen Bradford continued baking pies for 50 more years. She died in 1994, age 92. Among her papers, her daughter found letters, dozens of them from Germany, from Hans, Werner, Friedrich, and others she had served on that December day in 1944. They wrote about their lives, their families, their memories of Texas and pie, and the moment propaganda shattered under the weight of simple hospitality. One letter from Werner Schmidt in 1989 arrived just after the Berlin Wall fell. Mrs. Bradford, I am 70 years old now. I have grandchildren. Today I made your apple pie. The recipe you gave to Hans, who gave it to me. I made it for my family, and while we ate, I told them about Texas, about you, about the day I learned that enemies are a political creation, but humanity is real. They asked me what defeated the Nazis. I told them many things, soldiers certainly, but also women who baked pies and proved that mercy is stronger than hate. Thank you for teaching me this. Thank you for the pie that crossed oceans and years and still teaches. The Christmas dinner at Camp Swift on December 3, 1944, was not strategically significant. It didn't shorten the war or save lives in the immediate sense. But it was part of something larger, the American experiment in believing that democracy works, that human rights matter even for enemies, that the way you treat the defeated determines what kind of peace you build. The Geneva Convention required adequate food and shelter. It didn't require apple pie. It didn't require women serving enemies with the same care they served their families. It didn't require teaching English or organizing gardens or treating young men far from home as if they were sons who had lost their way rather than threats to be contained. But the women of Bastrop County chose these things anyway, because they believed in something stronger than revenge. They believed that how you treat people when you have power over them reveals your true character. They believed, perhaps without articulating it consciously, that peace is built not just through treaties, but through countless small acts that acknowledge shared humanity. The German prisoners who ate pie that December day went home changed. They carried with them the taste of mercy, the memory of kindness when cruelty would have been legally permissible. They rebuilt Germany with these memories, informing their understanding of democracy, of human rights, of how enemies can become allies. This is not sentimentality. This is how transformation happens, not through grand speeches, but through apple pie served by a woman whose son fights your former comrades. through pecan pie that makes you sob before you taste it because kindness, when you expect cruelty, breaks something open inside you that propaganda had sealed shut. In 2004, a group of former Camp Swift prisoners returned to Bastrop County for a 60th anniversary reunion. They were old men now, some with walkers, many with grandchildren in tow. They toured the campsite, mostly overgrown now, the barracks long demolished. They visited the cemetery where they had once repaired fences, and they met with children and grandchildren of the women who had served them. There were photographs, faded images from 1944, young prisoners and young women. Everyone frozen in a moment when war was present but not defining. One former prisoner, 93 years old, held a photograph of Helen Bradford serving pie. He traced her face with one finger, tears running down his weathered cheek. "This woman," he said in accented but perfect English, "she defeated more Nazis than a division of tanks, with pie, with kindness, with showing us we were wrong about everything. This is American power, not just bombs, but the belief that enemies can become friends if you remember they are human first." The war ended 75 years ago. The camps are gone, the prisoners dead or dying, the women who served them passed into history. But the legacy remains, carried forward in stories, in recipes, in the understanding that how we treat enemies determines not just who we are, but who we become. On a December day in 1944, in a mess hall in Texas, young German men sobbed into apple pie because they had been taught that enemies were monsters, and instead found mothers. They had been prepared for hatred and found mercy. They had expected America to be everything Nazi propaganda promised, weak, degenerate, without values, and instead discovered a strength they couldn't have imagined, the strength to be kind when kindness wasn't required. That is what defeated Nazism in their hearts. Not tanks or bombs, though those were necessary, but apple pie, served with care, proving that civilization persists even in war, that humanity matters even when it's difficult, that mercy, offered freely, transforms both giver and receiver. The prisoners went home changed. The women who served them were changed too. And in that exchange, pie for tears, kindness for propaganda, a truth was proven that still matters. That how we treat enemies when we have power reveals who we are, and that choosing mercy over cruelty, even in small ways, even in war, builds the kind of peace that lasts. Texas, 1944. The scent of cinnamon and butter crossed enemy lines and proved stronger than hate. Remember that. Tell the story. Make the pie.